I can't believe it's week 6 already. We're halfway through the course. Time flies when you're having fun, eh? Welcome back, everyone. You're now experts in the presentation of self in everyday life and frame analysis. This week we're going to look at one more of Goffman's books. This one is called Stigma, and it's about, you guessed it, stigma. You are not required to read this book, but you are most welcome to read it if you'd like. I've also posted a couple of articles written by Professor Timming on the LMS. He is an expert in this area. Over to you, Professor.
Thanks, Irving. You're right. It's amazing that we're halfway through the semester already. I hope you've enjoyed your learning odyssey this far. You sure will know a lot about Goffman's dramaturgy when you're done with this course, that's for sure. As Irving just said, this week we'll be learning about Goffman's Stigma. It's a short book, less than 150 pages. This book is all about how people with stigma, both visible and invisible, manage their spoiled identities. As we go through our lives, we are very much aware of the power of norms. They are always acting on us like gravity. Norms tell us what to wear, how much we should weigh, what to say, how to behave. And when we deviate from these norms, there is usually a price to pay. Abnormality is generally looked down upon. We want to fit in with the group. We want to conform. And this is as true in the workplace as it is in your daily lives outside of work. So in this book, Goffman focuses on actors who fail to conform to societal norms. These social deviants bear the burden of stigma. They often face serious discrimination from a judgmental public. As a result, they're always trying to normalize their appearance and behavior so that they can better fit in. Stigma is all about how we are subject to societal norms and how we seek as best as possible to adhere to those norms. And when we don't, we usually try to conceal our defects so that others accept us as normal. As always, the lecture will be divided into 2 parts with a short LMS activity interspliced. Let's get started. Everyone can be said to have some form of stigma. Sometimes it's visible and it's difficult to conceal. Other times it's invisible and easy to keep a secret. The point is, no one is blemish-free. We all have imperfections and peccadillos. It's just part of being human. Maybe your body is slightly asymmetrical. Maybe you have an unsightly birthmark on your face. Or maybe you have an unsightly birthmark on your back. Maybe you've committed a serious crime, or maybe you're bald. Maybe you've got a stutter or a stammer, or maybe you don't know how to read. There are so many characteristics that are stigmatic that it's impossible to list them all. But what each of these traits shares in common is that we are all somehow and for some reason embarrassed by them. But why? Think about this for a moment. Why would we be embarrassed about any aspect of ourselves? So what if we're bald? Why is that considered so defective that many people use wigs or tonics aimed at hair follicle growth? It's a fascinating question. Why does it matter that we are not, in a word, ideal? Or perhaps even more importantly, how do we define ideal? What does it mean to be perfect in both presentation and behavior? These are all important questions at the heart of Goffman's Stigma. The book was published in 1963 and articulates some of Goffman's thoughts on the nature of normality and abnormality in society. Now, it is an extremely profound book, and one that everyone, I think, will be able to identify with. Why? Well, because as I said, we all have some sort of stigma or another. We all try to conceal certain aspects of ourselves from others. Let's take a look at this book and think about how these principles might apply in a workplace. We should always start with definitions. That way, everyone will be on the same page and clear about the terms that are being used. Stigma is originally an ancient Greek word. It means, interestingly enough, tattoo, or a visible mark that exposes something bad about one's moral character. So a stigma is essentially a mark of shame, much like the scarlet letter A that Hester Prynne was made to wear. Hester Prynne is the main character of Nathaniel Hawthorne's classic The Scarlet Letter, about a woman who was forced to wear a red A on her clothing to project to the world that she was guilty of adultery. In fact, even her illegitimate child was stigmatized through association, as illustrated here.
Go away. You cannot play with us. Go away.
Hey, well, Mrs. Prynne, it's as good as new.
Thank you. You should be ashamed of yourself. She started it. She's to blame.
Didgery, come here. Who did it?
She did it.
You little heathen. I'll teach you.
Look to your own children, mistress. My child was not to blame.
Yours is the blame. If you were an honest, God-fearing woman and brought your child up in a proper manner, this would never happen.
Say what you will about me. I can tolerate your insults. But lay not a hand on my child or you will rue it.
How dare you speak like that to me?
So a stigma can rub off from one person to another. Such is the power of deviations from socially accepted norms. The disgrace of a stigma runs deep. Now, Goffman lists various types of stigma up front. I should point out in advance that stigma is an historically situated construct. What does this mean? Well, what's viewed as a stigma in one point in time may not be viewed as a stigma at another point in time. Social attitudes, folkways, and mores can and do change across history. Similarly, what might be viewed as stigmatic in one culture or society may not be viewed as stigmatic in another culture or society. So you need to read this list in the context of 1960s America. Some of the stigma that Goffman identified are still stigma now. Others, not so much. The examples he gives in the book include, but are not limited to, physical deformities, speech defects, ex-mental patients, the unemployed, the illiterate, the divorced, the elderly, the overweight or the obese, those who are smelly, disabled, homeless, childless, gypsies, carnival workers, compulsive gamblers, orphans, alcoholics or drug addicts, criminals or ex-cons, members of the LGBTI community, prostitutes, people who are deaf, blind, psychotic or neurotic, people who have seizures, colostomies, political dissidents, or even a spouse or a child with these traits. Again, this list has changed. Certainly, to be, for example, childless or divorced or a member of the LGBTI community isn't nearly as stigmatic today as it once was. So I ask that you take this list of examples with a grain of salt. So underlying Goffman's theory of stigma is that when an individual presents with a visible stigma, we impute that he or she is somehow bad, weak, tainted, discredited, or handicapped in some way. Now, obviously, this isn't true. People with visible stigmas can be very strong, capable, and powerful. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a former president of the United States who pulled the country out of the Great Depression with his New Deal, was wheelchair-bound as a result of polio. But he's widely considered to be one of the greatest presidents in the history of the United States. But as you found out with Goffman's other books, what's true is secondary to what people believe to be true. Okay? So generally speaking, we see people with stigma in a negative light. Goffman further argues that a stigma can be visible or invisible. A visible stigma might be a dermatological illness that leaves scars all over your skin, whereas an invisible stigma might be, for example, a mental illness that cannot be seen readily by others. According to Goffman, when a stigma is immediately evident, the individual is already discredited. So someone with a severe facial deformity cannot simply conceal his or her face, so he or she can be defined as someone who's already discredited. But when a stigma is hidden, the individual is not yet discredited, but rather discreditable. This means that the individual is on the brink of being discredited if the stigma becomes evident to others. He goes on to define 3 types of stigma. Abominations of the body are usually visible stigma that point to non-normality of presentation. Problems of moral character usually include invisible stigma, such as criminal convictions or unnatural sexual proclivities. And then there is the stigma of group membership. This means that you are stigmatized as a result of your social identity. For example, members of minority groups are often subject to collective stigmatization in a society. Now, Goffman's framework is pretty simple. He divides the world into 2 groups. First, what he calls the stigmatized, and secondly, what he calls the normals. The stigmatized include anyone with a contaminated social identity. Normals are simply everyone else. Okay, so have a look at this video on the stigma surrounding mental health. It really shows how invisible stigma in people makes it difficult to present themselves in that way in public. And that people who have invisible stigma often present themselves as normals, but deep down they know that they're not normal at all. Have a look. Goffman distinguishes between the strategies used by visibly and invisibly stigmatized individuals. He argues that visibly stigmatized individuals seek to manage tension because they are already discredited by others. Their visible stigma is not readily concealable. So when they enter social interaction, they attempt, as best as possible, to reduce that tension and to appear like a normal. When others feel uncomfortable about their visible stigma, they try to reduce their discomfort, thereby reducing tension and potential embarrassment. On the other hand, invisibly stigmatized individuals are not yet discredited. Remember, they are called discreditable. So there's no tension to manage just yet. Instead, they focus on trying to manage information surrounding their stigma. As long as the audience does not find out about their defects, then they appear like normals. So, invisibly stigmatized individuals spend a huge amount of time in trying to conceal the source of their stigma. This may mean keeping a mental illness secret, or not disclosing a criminal history. This may mean concealing one's sexual orientation or sexual preferences. In short, the lives of discreditable people are consumed with trying to keep their stigmas from emerging within the social milieu. Once their stigma is revealed, then they shift, of course, from managing information to managing tension. Visibly or obviously stigmatized individuals, according to Goffman, view themselves in the same way as normals see them, that is to say, as less than equal. They're often just as ashamed of themselves and their own stigma as others are of them and it. As a result, visibly stigmatized individuals attempt to correct the defect in order to pass as a normal. This might involve, for example, plastic surgery to normalize one's appearance, or concealing a stigma under clothing or makeup. In societies where dark skin is considered a stigma, people might undergo skin lightening or hair flattening procedures. For those with mental illnesses, correction might involve engaging with psychotherapy or taking psychiatric medications. The aim of such interventions is to present oneself as a normal. Now, Goffman was only interested in what he called the point of mixed contact between the stigmatized and the normal. What does this mean? So when a normal interacts with another normal, there is no stigma-based tension. And so there's not that much that's sociologically interesting about such an interaction. Similarly, when a stigmatized person interacts with another stigmatized person, there is again no tension. So there's also not much that's sociologically interesting about that social interaction. If two people with facial disfigurements meet each other in the absence of normals, they don't need to feel uncomfortable or embarrassed about their visual impairment. They can be at ease with one another. What Goffman is interested in this book is the point of mixed contact where the stigmatized and the normal confront one another in the same geographical space. Right? These kinds of situations are sociologically very interesting in the study. The normal, whether intentionally or not, places a huge amount of pressure on the stigmatized as a result of their failure to conform. As a result, the stigmatized tries hard to manage this tension, shame, and embarrassment. Because of the potential for embarrassment, many stigmatized people isolate themselves from social contact with normals. Goffman points out that at times normals will try to accommodate stigmatized people and reduce or eliminate the pressure of conformity, but many just stare at them. And this is especially the case with young children who are not yet aware of how their behavior can impact on others' feelings and sense of self-worth. But the key point here is that, generally speaking, both the stigmatized and the normals approach mixed contact with some anxiety and discomfort. This is what makes the situation, as I said before, sociologically interesting. Now, it's easy to see how this theory applies in a workplace context. Both at work and in a job interview, the stigmatized enter into mixed contact with normals. I think this clip nicely captures how it feels to be a visibly stigmatized job applicant in a labor market that is effectively dominated by normals. Have a look.
There are 500,000 people in the UK with a facial disfigurement. The problem is that many of them find that their experience in the workplace is very disappointing.
My name's Lizzie Clark. I'm 21 years old and I've got Golden House syndrome. 19, but I've applied for a lot more that I hadn't heard from. 1 in 2 in particular. I got down to the last 2 and she rang me up to say, we don't feel that you could handle the angry customers because of my nature and probably the way I looked. I thought that was a bit silly really, because I handle them like every day now, over the telephone and through the door. She wasn't even prepared to give me a chance either, so they're lost really.
Quite right. The good news is that it doesn't have to be like this. There are many people with an unusual appearance who have achieved great success at work, and their employers value their contributions hugely.
I knew that we had a job coming up in our reception, so I interviewed 2 to 3 people. Obviously when Lizzie came in, there was no contest really. She just had it all there, the enthusiasm, also the skill set, but most of all she had the ability really to do the job, and obviously lots of drive. I couldn't believe that she'd done 19 applications and nobody has snapped her up. So, we feel that employers who have rejected or not given her a job, it's their loss and our gain, really.
The campaign is called What Success Looks Like, and it's all about transforming the expectations and confidence of individuals with disfigurements and employers across the whole nation.
I'd like to become a bit more senior role in here. If I was Prime Minister, I would make it easier for people like me getting to work.
Please join our campaign. Whether you're an individual with a facial disfigurement or an employer, please share your story of success, of good practice, so that we can demonstrate that disfigurement need not be an issue in the workplace ever again.
I think this is a powerful and important campaign. It raises an essential question about what kind of society we are and what kind of society we should be. I want you to think about your role in mixed contact. Are you a stigmatized individual? Are you a normal? And if the latter, how do you approach mixed contact with the stigmatized? Can you see them as individuals of equal worth in comparison to normals, or do you only see their defect? I want you to think about these questions as I now pass you back to Irving, my avatar, so that he can tell you about this week's exercise to be done on the LMS. See you in a bit.